So next we'll look at the work of Alvin Lucier. And Alvin Lucier was a pioneer of music composition and performance. He was working at the same time as John Cage and Max Neuhaus. And he included in his performances physical gestures, the use of brain waves in live performance, and the generation of visual imagery by sound and vibrating media. But he was most interested in this idea of feedback and the ways in which the evocation of a room, the acoustics in the room, could be used to create sound. So in the two works we'll look at by Alvin Lucier, he uses feedback and the resonance of a room and bodies moving in a room to create an abstracted soundscape. This is a later work called Empty Vessels from 1977, and it belongs to a series of work in which Alvin Lucier studies the resonant characteristics of the smallest of interior spaces. So he's placed 8 water container glasses and vases on pedestals along one of the space's walls. And this, I believe, on the right is an installation of the work in London, and on the left is one in Paris. So it's been installed and reinstalled in multiple places. So microphones are placed in the openings of these empty vessels, and each is routed through limiters to speakers. So microphones are placed in the openings of these empty vessels, and each is routed through limiters to speakers. And there's 8 loudspeakers that are positioned exactly opposite along the facing wall. The amplifier in each microphone loudspeaker system is selected in such a way that each strand of feedback is marked by the resonant characteristics of the respective vessels. So each of the kind of feedback sounds in one vessel then comes through the speaker on the opposite end of the room. And this creates a controlled feedback field of resonant tones and their interferences in the gallery space. So interferences happen when bodies move in the gallery space. And I'm going to show a video of a recreation of this work so you can see how this functions. So when entering the gallery space, the visitor disrupts the delicate balance of the system, creating new feedbacks with unexpected frequencies. Even the smallest head movement is enough to hear a multifaceted, fluctuating spectrum of pitches. The emptiness of these vessels it's interesting that they're empty here because they are filled with sound. The room feels as if it is being filled by the thickness of the tone of this sound work. And it highlights the spatiality of sound and the ways in which it articulates space or is shaped by bodies moving in space. So consider here when we look at, and here's a detail of the work here, so you can kind of see the emptiness of these vessels. But when I play the recreation of this work, think about the ways in which the body engages with sound and space, and it changes the viewer's kind of individual perceptions of space. So here is a recreation of this work. And I'm playing a recreation because I could not find good physical documentation of this work. And I found that this was the most explanatory. So let's watch this recreation. So, in this work, you see the ways in which the body moving in space changes the resonances and the frequencies of the sound that the work creates. So, here's an example of not the, I mean, we're kind of working with limited equipment due to COVID, but the ways in which you can start thinking about how sound, objects, bodies, and space relate, and how you can actually use space. And a cavernous long space will make a different sound or will resonate a different sound than a landscape outside. So even thinking about how, or rather where you record sound, where you might want to record and then play back sound with a speaker into a space and see what that does to the sound, that would be a really interesting experimentation that you could think about for this assignment. So I couldn't talk about Alvin Lucier without talking about his most famous piece, I'm Sitting in a Room. And this was, his a landmark work, and it was conceived for a voice and electromagnetic tape. So this piece was first performed in 1969, 1970, and here is Lucier at the Museum of Modern Art in 2014 reperforming the work. So in the work, Lucier reads a text into a microphone, and attempting to smooth out his stutter, he began with the lines, I am sitting in a room, the same room you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice. And as described in the text, his voice was recorded and then played back into the room. This process was repeated again and again, and with each iteration, Lucier's recorded speech grew muddled, sounding distant, and specific sonic frequencies started to dominate the recorded sound. So the sound, as it played back, it began as kind of very transparent, matter of fact, describing an event taking place, to then being played back within the room. And like the previous work, Empty Vessels, that we just looked at, the way that sound reverberates within the room starts to transform how the work then is recorded again. So as the work is repeated, it starts to deteriorate. And as the frequencies in the room grow, reinforced with each playback, the result is an erasure of the human performer and the dominance of an environmental kind of soundscape. In this work, I'm sitting in a room. It's most influential for its treatment of space as a component of sonic production. So the conceptual kind of crux of this work is a radical refusal of the logic of musical composition. Rather than using traditionally musical means to create sound, so a piano, violin, which Lucier has done before, here he's using his voice and then a technological process to reveal natural occurring acoustic phenomena. So the fact that sound, its frequencies change depending on which space it is played in or it is performed in. So now I want to play, I'll just play an excerpt from I'm Sitting in a Room, just so you can get a sense of how the sound starts to become abstracted.
Semblance of my speech. I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves, so that any semblance of my speech, with perhaps the exception of rhythm, is destroyed. What you will hear then are the natural resonant frequencies of the room articulated by speech. I regard this activity not so much as a demonstration of a physical fact, but more as a way to smooth out any irregularities my speech might have. I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves, so that any semblance of my speech, with perhaps the exception of rhythm, is destroyed. What you will hear then are the natural resonant frequencies of the room articulated by speech. I regard this activity not so much as a demonstration of a physical fact, but more as a way to smooth out any irregularities my speech might have. I am sitting in a room.
So in the work, you hear the ways in which Alvin Lucier's speech becomes muddled and almost at the same, it really kind of smooths out the amplification of his voice because it is resonating within the room and there is a feedback of those frequencies in the recording. If you want to experiment with this at home in Adobe Audition, though it's not true to the work itself, try layering a recorded sound in the multi-track editor and then just play it and see the ways in which just by layering sound, it completely abstract, like layering one sound or a vocal audio recording, you can see the way that layering completely abstracts that recording. So you could try this in addition as you're experimenting while you're learning the program. We just have a few more artists to look at for this week in relation to assignment 1, and I'll probably talk about more artists in relation to this assignment for our lecture next week, so you can begin kind of developing your project as you're learning Adobe Audition and start experimenting with recorded sound as you're learning. So this is the work of Jules Gimbrone, who is a composer, performer, and artist based in LA. And they received a BA from Smith College in 2004 and an MFA in music composition from California Institute of the Arts in 2014. And we'll look at two works from Jules Gimbrone. This is the first piece, Monomorphic Surfaces, or What I Listen for When I Listen in Men's Bathrooms, from 2016. In Jules Gimbrone's work, they create a fragile corporeal sound and sculptural assemblage that highlight the differentiations between modes of perception, perceptual acquisition, or modes, blah. Jules Gimbrone creates fragile corporeal sound and sculptural assemblages that highlight differentiations between modes of perceptual acquisition, so how phenomena appears to us, specifically visual and sonic, within complex and precarious arrangements of subjects and objects. Building on this is an expansive idea of the phenomenology of resonance. And we'll look at the idea of phenomenology in a moment because I think it's really important, an important conceptual framework for this first assignment. So they look at phenomenology of resonance. And phenomenology is just a fancy word for the study or philosophy of how phenomena appears to a sensing body. And they're thinking about social performativity, so how social structures and bodies perform in space, how identity develops, relationships between subjects, so that's us, and objects, things that we encounter, what those relationships are, all being inherent to the accumulation of layers that are built on materiality that is transparent, fragile, and has a kind of surface quality, a kind of wet surface quality. And resonance, to define it, is a set of kind of conditions or relationships between things. So we've been talking thus far about how sound resonates in a space. So that's the relationship between, frequencies and spatial structures. So resonance is the set of conditions or relationships between things, and they become activated and legible through light and sound, then complicated through abstraction and perceptual manipulation. So we looked at this in Lucier's work, we looked at this in Newhouse's work, etc. And Gimbrone's work has appeared in many institutions. This was a pop-up show in LA, and we'll look then also at a show that they did in Sculpture Center, which is a project we'll talk about in the professional developments lecture later on in the semester. So the piece that we're looking at now is a 4-foot-tall glass vessel that's placed on a small platform and situated in front of the bathroom mirror. The vessel contains salt water, cooking oil, a desiccated banana, a balloon, water beads, 2 brass bells, and recording of pee going into a pot. So this is an idea of, objects and recordings interacting within a work. And this vessel is accompanied by another that has been broken. So you can see that on the left. In their work, Gimbrone uses a variety of recording and amplifying technologies. So here you can see that these are contact microphones, and contact microphones, you can actually make them yourself. If you look on YouTube, there's lots of DIY videos that you can make contact mics yourself, and the parts are pretty easy to source. So these contact mics are stuck onto these objects, and then they're recording actually the sound of these objects. They also use materials such as clay, ice, and then the ambient sound of past performances. And they investigate how sound travels through space and bodies, and then language as a way of exploring hidden or sublimated gendered systems. So, of course, the bathroom is a space in which gender is performed and regulated by social structures. As a transgender non-binary person, Gimbrone cites the bathroom as a particular space where thoughts and projections regarding these differences, specifically the difference of genitalia, become emphasized in a way that is not felt elsewhere. The concept of biopolitics, so that is the government or some sort of hegemonic system of regulations, starts to control and manage populations. So that's what biopolitics means. So they're interested in the biopolitics that articulates these differences within these spaces and the materiality of sex in general, that are constructs of political and social power structures that attempt to enforce authority over bodies by constricting them to assigned gendered categories. And I'm going to include another, in our modules, another video of Jules Gimbrone, a performance work that was presented in a space that actually Kevin Beasley, an artist that we talked about last week, he created at MoMA PS1 called All Gold, in which all of these kind of sound performances happened. And Jules Gimbrone, who was not present at the time, but there were these two panelists that played a work of theirs, and I'm going to play that, or I'll attach a link to that so you can listen to that if you're interested. Okay, so Gimbrone's vessels exist beyond the confines of their glass walls and continue in the form of their audio, hitting our ears and tissues, their conceptual, political, visual, and auditory interpretations, and an infinite number of manifestations, as with all bodies. And Gimbrone is really interested in, and I know I've been kind of hammering this throughout the lecture, but, you know, the space between resonant, like almost the space, but like the third space between how sound and bodies and space interact. So what are the kind of slippages that happen, like the abstraction that happens in Alvin Lucier's work? So there's slippages that happen within these interactions. Things aren't, transparent. And when I say transparent, I mean obvious. They're not facts in front of us, but rather there are these slippages when things start to interact. And Jules Gimbrone is very interested in those slippages as this kind of third space. And if we think about gendered binary categories of, there is this or this, male or female, or these kind of binary categories that are presented to us that then we're supposed to fit into. If we think about subject-object in that way, or sound space as these binary things they interact but they don't mix, Gimbrone is interested in that mixing, that in-between space where things become slippery, muddy, or abstracted. And through that abstraction, there then becomes this slippages of categories. So both these vessels are filled with these materials. Contact mics sound these objects as bodies move through this space, and they start to reverberate. The sound of peeing in a pot begins to resonate with the materials that are inside of these vessels. So it's all about the interaction of material and the slipperiness between those interactions. This is Gimbrone's next work, Dimorphous Draw a Line. And this is a piece that was presented at Sculpture Center's In Practice exhibition, Another Echo. And this is something that you guys could apply to if you wanted. The application call is every summer in August. And the Sculpture Center is located in Brooklyn, New York. So this is a piece that they did. And what do I want to say about this piece? So this is a piece that they installed in the Sculpture Center, and it's similar to the work that we just looked at in terms of its these vessels, both broken and complete, housing this range of materials. Cooking oil, again, is present, salt, broken glass, balloons, all of these kind of random banal materials. And banal just means every day. So here contact mics are placed on each vessel, and recorded sound is from past performances. Recorded sound of banal objects are introduced through the contact mic, and then the contact mic also records that resonance, amplifies that resonance against the materials housed within each glass vessel. So notice that the vessels, it's not just one vessel, it's multiple vessels. So, and this is again, a long cavernous space. So think back to Max Neuhaus's work, that there's this long cavernous space. Sound is not only resonating within these chambers, these vessels, and then within the kind of liquid content within the vessel, but then also within the cavernous space in the basement of the sculpture center. So now I'm going to show a walkthrough video that Jules Gimbrone took themselves of the piece in the basement of the sculpture center, so you get a sense of what it feels like, sounds like in real space. And here you can see, because of the resonance of the object, and think back to Alvin Lucier's piece, the water is, because of the frequencies, are starting to react. You can see here the connections between Alvin Lucier's work and Jules Gimbrone's work. The idea of this language breakdown, the abstraction of language, and the way in which frequencies start to reverberate against the space of both the vessels and the cavernous space at the sculpture center. Jules Gimbrone is also interested in voice, because voice is a signifier of gender. And as they transitioned, they started to notice the different kind of sounding of their voice and different decibels that their voice would make. So then the kind of slipperiness between gender and sound starts to emerge within Gimbrone's body through their voice. So they use their voice a lot as a material in their work, as this kind of signifier of the slipperiness between binary categories, in the same way that there's a slipperiness between the sound of each vessel. Nothing is really isolated, everything is mixing. Stop the work here. So I want to end. I had a few more artists that I wanted to talk about today, but I don't want to make the lecture any longer than an hour. So we'll talk about Bruce Nauman, Martha Rossler, and Christine Kim Sung next week, in addition to some other artists that relate to our first assignment. But I wanted to end the lecture by talking about this idea of phenomenology, because I believe that it relates to and could perform as a conceptual grounding for this first assignment, beyond the kind of technical requirements that you're kind of learning in Adobe Edition. So in the assignment, what you're doing is thinking about how the body perceives the world, not as transparent or matter of fact, but how the body kind of actually perceives the world. So when you start to kind of forget your natural attitude towards the world and start really thinking about how how kind of fragmented the world is. Like, just imagine as you're walking around, you're a body moving around in space, and the world is kind of moving up and down, and there's lots of stimuli, lots of sounds, and your body stabilizes that for you. So what does it mean to break that down? So all the artists that we've looked at today, in some way, shape, or form, think about phenomena and how technology might highlight phenomena that's already there, or how sound might kind of augment a space or augment a perception of one's perception of a space ever so slightly, or one's perception of voice, or of how voice reverberates or resonates within a room. So I wanted to talk about the strangeness of the world. And so I want to ground this in Maurice Merleau-Ponty's understanding of visual perception, so that we can then talk about sonic perception. So, because I think vision is a good place to start to then move to a less articulated aspect of phenomenology, which is sound. So Merleau-Ponty was a French philosopher from he wrote this book called The Phenomenology of Perception in the 1950s, and then it was published in the 60s in America, or in North America, in English. And he wrote this text. So he wrote that book, which was kind of foundational in terms of its extension of phenomenology, which was already kind of happening with both of his teachers, Heidegger and Husserl. So he wrote that book, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but let's focus on this essay that he wrote on Cézanne's doubt, because Merleau-Ponty thought painters were actually doing phenomenology. And so phenomenology, I'm just going to skip ahead to just talk about what it is for a second. Phenomenology is essentially just, you already know what phenomenology is. It's a fancy word for how phenomena appears to us. And rather than trying to do a kind of sociological analysis of how phenomena appears or why it appears, phenomenology is just concerned with describing the world as it appears. So at first, that sounds like describing the world as factual. But once one kind of breaks down the world as one perceives it, you realize that actually we have a conception of the world as it is told to us. Apples are red. Well, we know, now I'm just going to move back here, in a painting course that I'm sure many of you are taking or have taken, you're supposed to, in your painting still life, you paint what you see, not what you think you see. So when you begin to paint shadow, you realize that actually shadow is not gray. It is multiple colors, and it is also reflecting the light from both, the color of light, also the objects that the shadow belongs to. It is not just gray, it is a tone of the color of that object. So even the idea that apples are red is an idea of an apple versus what an apple actually looks like in real space, which is reflecting light, reflecting other objects around it. So Merleau-Ponty, when he wrote Cézanne's Doubt in 1945, he found that Cézanne was actually articulating this type of perception. What does it mean to, when we perceive the world, we don't perceive the world from the stationary position. We are a body that's moving around. And therefore, when we see things, they're not stable. They're actually, they're moving. And so what Cézanne was doing in this painting, his painting of the quarry and this painting, famous painting, Still Life with Apples, you notice the still life is kind of falling away from the surface, or it looks like things are kind of slightly moving towards us. And Cézanne was interested in painting as he was, a body moving, and painting those different perspectives. And actually, that would be a more truer perception of these objects versus painting it from this kind of Eurocentric point of perspective, which is, stable and direct. So he's breaking this down. So how does this relate to sound? So throughout the lecture, I've been talking about the ways in which sound, we've really been talking about resonance throughout this lecture, and how sound reverberates off or within a space, how sound is heard when it is played or recorded with other sounds or with an amplifier. So the sound is actually relational. It's not existing in a vacuum. So when Jules Gimbrone and Alvin Lucier and Max Neuhaus are exploring sound, what they're doing is disrupting our natural attitude towards sound, the way that we think about sound as just being there. They're really trying to lift up its experienced and felt characteristics through frequency, through amplification, through resonance, etc. So phenomenology actually is, in its description of this, of how the body experiences phenomena and then recording that phenomena. So not taking something as matter of fact, but taking something as how it actually is operating in a world through the perception of a sensing body. We can think about sound in that way, in the same way that Cézanne is thinking about vision. So that sound is something that is experienced. And therefore it doesn't sound the way we might think it sounds. It's reacting all the time to space, to time, to other sounds in the room, etc. So I think, this is an important concept or approach to think about when you are experimenting with sounding objects, creating a landscape. How might you take the sound of a cup, to bring it back to the beginning of the lecture, and augment that in a way to highlight its kind of characteristics or highlight its sound. Okay, that concludes our lecture for week 2. Next week, I'll introduce a few more artists in relation to our first assignment. And like this week, you'll still be working on the Adobe Adobe Audition program and playing around with that software. But for week 3, please begin either recording sounds, playing around with how objects sound with either your recorder that you've picked up from Sheridan or your phone. You can also buy mics that you can attach to your any kind of smartphone. You could do that. So try recording sound. Try playing back that sound with a speaker in different spaces and then recording that. See how that sounds. Start to experiment with sound and introduce that into your files as you learn Adobe Audition. And we can discuss any questions you might have.